stop whatever you are doing right now, because the story I am about to tell you is going to rearrange the way you think about American history. This isn't just a tale of hard times. This is a true account of human beings deliberately burying themselves alive, praying they would wake up 6 months later. Can you believe that in the heart of the booming, hopeful American West, there existed a terrifying seasonal phenomenon, a catastrophe no one saw coming, where entire families, brimming with the promise of the future, had to willingly enter a state of forced, desperate hibernation. They weren't just surviving the winter, folks. We are talking about the American Rockies, circa 1850. The era of the mountain man, the gold rush, and the relentless, almost insane push westward. These pioneers, the fearless ones, the ambitious ones, they didn't just want California gold. They wanted the perfect valley, the hidden meadow, the land that nobody else had claimed yet. They sought isolation as a virtue, a sign that they had truly conquered the wilderness. But what they found instead was a landscape that tolerated their presence for exactly 6 months, before slamming the door shut with a force that defied imagination. Imagine the scene. October in the high country. The air is so sharp it feels like shattered glass, but the sun is golden, painting the massive peaks in hues of copper and impossible blue. The settlers, men like Jeremiah Croft and his small, ambitious company, are feverishly building their log cabins. They've packed in just enough salted pork, just enough dried beans, just enough hope to last them until spring thaw. They calculated the risks. They accounted for the snow. Or so they thought. They measured the drifts of previous years based on the flimsy accounts of unreliable trappers, men who usually fled the high altitudes long before the true terror descended. They thought they were prepared for a harsh winter. They were about to meet the very definition of geological malice. The first sign that something was fundamentally, cosmically wrong was not the cold, but the silence. A silence so profound it felt like the world had been muted. The chirping birds vanished first, followed by the rustle of deer in the underbrush. Then the heavy atmosphere began to shift, a viscous, gray ceiling descending upon the valley floor, trapping the sound and the light beneath it. This was not a storm front. This was the mountain range deciding it was done with visitors. The temperature dropped so fast it felt like hitting a wall. And then the snow started. Not the gentle, picturesque flakes of a Christmas card, but giant, wet, suffocating clots that seemed to fall not from the clouds, but directly from the sky's broken heart. Day 1, 8 inches, manageable. Day 3, 2 feet, worrying. By the end of the first week, the snow was already higher than the eaves of the cabins. This was when the pioneers' confidence began to fracture, replaced by a cold, metallic dread. They were not just snowed in, they were being entombed. The very act of opening the cabin door became a Herculean effort against a blinding wall of white powder that threatened to flood their meager living space. The only light now came from a small window, already half buried, filtering the midday sun into a dim, ghostly twilight. But the snow kept falling. It didn't stop for 2 weeks. Then 3. It became a relentless, crushing weight, pressing down on the logs, muffling every sound, until the settlers were living in a deep-sea silence. The roof groaned under the impossible load, the structural supports trembling like nervous horses. Croft looked at his meager supplies, realizing the horrific truth. They were 600 miles from the nearest functioning supply depot, and the 6-month clock had just started ticking. But they had consumed a month's worth of energy just fighting the initial ingress of the snow. This is the point where survival turns into something primal, something almost mythological. The settlers realized that digging out was impossible. The snow outside was now stacked, not in neat drifts, but in monumental, layered slabs reaching heights of 20, sometimes 30 feet. They were living in ice bunkers. They were prisoners in the most beautiful, deadly jail on Earth. The only path forward was down into the deep recesses of their own homes, conserving every calorie, every flicker of firelight, praying that the world outside would forget they existed. They had to become less than human. They had to become sleepers. The strategy was desperate, shocking, and the only possible way out. If they slept most of the day, if they limited their movement to the absolute minimum, if they let their body temperature drop just enough to slow their metabolic processes, they might stretch 8 weeks of food into 24. The children were told stories of the long sleep, the mythical rest that would deliver them to spring. The adults knew it was a slow, agonizing descent into near death. The air grew thick and heavy, saturated with the smell of unwashed wool and wood smoke. The cabin became a suffocating world, defined by the tiny, flickering oil lamp, the only measure of time left to them. Days merged into weeks, marked only by the dwindling level of the flour barrel and the increasing desperation in their eyes. They didn't just worry about starving. They worried about freezing, about the crushing weight of the mountain deciding to cave in their roof, about the creeping madness that accompanies total sensory deprivation and unending darkness. They were preparing for the longest, most dangerous sleep in the history of the frontier. And trust me, the nightmares were just beginning. This is the untold story of the settlers who went to bed in October, hoping beyond hope that they would wake up for the spring thaw. Stay tuned, because the true horror of the long sleep is something you have to see to believe. The settlers didn't just go to sleep. They initiated a controlled shutdown, a desperate attempt to cheat death by slowing down the very rhythm of life itself. Banking on ancient, desperate measures they only half understood. The long sleep wasn't rest. It was a 6-month vigil, a terrifying negotiation with oblivion, where every single breath cost them precious, irreplaceable energy, and sanity was the first resource to be rationed. The pioneers, driven by a terrible, cold logic, meticulously sealed their wooden prisons, attempting to survive on the slimmest margin of existence. They lowered their caloric intake to almost nothing, existing on watery gruel and preserved beans so sparse they barely offered comfort, praying their bodies would mimic the deep, true slumber of the great mountain bears they had hunted only months before. But the human metabolism is a jealous beast, built not for hibernation, but for relentless burning, and it screamed in protest against this starvation tactic. The cold wasn't just external, it seeped into the marrow, a bone-deep, constant ache that no blanket could truly touch, a gnawing, insidious reminder that the vital, life-sustaining fires within them were being deliberately banked down to a single flickering ember. The first 3 weeks were a blur of restless, starving nightmares, punctuated only by the necessary, agonizing movement to conserve fuel. Wood became gold, and every shovelful of coal was treated like a priceless diamond. The rule was rigid: only enough heat to prevent immediate freezing, never enough to feel actual comfort. Comfort was a luxury they could no longer afford, a traitorous indulgence that would burn through their supplies faster than a wildfire through dry timber. And the world outside had utterly ceased to exist. In November, the storms arrived not as temporary blizzards, but as geological events. They were living not in a cabin, but inside a subterranean cave formed by the relentless, crushing weight of Rocky Mountain powder. The snow piled higher than the roofline, sealing the single window, plunging their lives into absolute, perpetual darkness. Imagine the psychological terror of that deep, claustrophobic blackness. It swallowed the light, and soon it began to swallow their minds. The only sound that penetrated the thick, icy walls was the relentless, booming pressure of the wind above, a sound that wasn't just air moving, but the mountain itself trying to physically dismantle their flimsy shelter. That sound was the voice of their fate, mocking their arrogance, flexing its icy muscles just to remind the settlers who truly owned this immense frozen domain. Time itself became meaningless, a horrifying, shapeless entity. Without the sun, without a reliable clock, without the natural rhythms of day and night, the settlers quickly lost their grasp on the calendar. Was it Tuesday, or was it the 90th day of endless twilight? No one knew, and soon no one dared to ask, fearful of the answer. They quickly realized that the biggest threat wasn't the external cold, but the internal chaos of their own minds. This was a psychological battlefield, fought in 4 walls of damp, freezing wood. The forced proximity magnified every minor irritation into a monumental, cabin-shaking feud. A cough became an accusation of wasting air. A sigh became a declaration of despair. They watched each other's eyes for signs of madness, because they knew the thin line between sanity and absolute breakdown was dissolving faster than the ice on a summer creek. One of the central pillars of the community, Elder Thomas, a man who had preached patience and faith since the journey began, started counting things. The knots in the wood, the breaths his wife took, the drips of condensation from the roof. He counted them all, over and over, meticulously recording meaningless data, until his voice became a dry, rasping drone, terrifying the others. The long sleep also brought the terrifying phenomenon of the famine dreams. Because their bodies were being starved of vital nutrients, their brains began generating elaborate, cruel hallucinations of feasts. They dreamed of roasting meats, fresh bread, and steaming coffee, only to wake up to the bitter, metallic taste of their own hunger. This wasn't just physical pain. It was torture designed by their own subconscious, an endless cycle of tantalizing promise and agonizing reality. They started hiding their tiny food rations, even from their own families, driven by the primal, desperate instinct to protect the last few calories that separated them from death. This distrust festered. When supplies were checked in January, a ritual performed under terrifying silence, they discovered the horrifying truth. The wood reserves were dwindling far faster than their most pessimistic calculations. The dampness and the relentless deep cold meant they needed to burn constantly, even at the lowest setting, just to keep the cabin air above the temperature where flesh freezes instantly. The arithmetic of survival shifted from bleak to impossible. They had maybe 6 weeks of effective heating left, but the mountain winter was known to stretch well into April, potentially meaning 2 more months of absolute, unbearable sub-zero exposure. A new, terrible meeting was called in the dim, shivering light of the single tallow lamp. The elder Thomas, momentarily shaking off his counting obsession, spoke the unspeakable truth. They had to choose. They could ration the wood even further, inviting immediate hypothermia and certain death from exposure. Or they could face the reality that not everyone would make it to see the spring. That night, the settlers realized their pact with the mountains had failed. They had traded their ambition for virgin land, for a death sentence. And now, they had to decide which lives were worth the wood they had left. The long sleep was over, replaced by a waking nightmare of impossible choices. Stay tuned, because the decisions made in that freezing cabin, driven by pure terror and starvation, haunt the history of the Rockies to this day. The line between pioneer and predator was about to be obliterated by the cold. The cabin wasn't just cold. It was a sarcophagus of frozen ambition. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the shallow, rattling breaths of the occupants, ghosts wrapped in stiff, filthy furs. Their bodies, stripped of fat and muscle, were entering a metabolic nightmare, achieving the stillness of the dead. This wasn't rest. It was a slow, agonizing self-consumption, a desperate attempt to cheat the reaper by pretending to already be halfway there. The fires were gone, reduced to banked, miserly embers, offering only the faintest illusion of warmth against the crushing, three-dimensional cold of the mountainside. Every twitch, every restless shift beneath the damp blankets was a monstrous waste of energy they no longer possessed. Their hearts beat with the slow, lethargic rhythm of a clock running on sand, conserving every precious jewel of warmth. They were living proof that human physiology can adapt to the impossible, but only at the cost of sanity and strength. The starvation was so profound that their system had switched fuel sources, burning protein and then structural fat, entering a deep state of ketosis. To the settlers, this process felt like an acid bath inside their skulls. A constant, metallic, sickly sweet taste coated their tongues, the stench of their own dying metabolism filling the unventilated air. They were literally rotting from the inside out, the biological debt collectors making their rounds minute by minute. The constant headache was the least of their worries. The world outside the cabin was a fortress of white silence, a cruel, mocking universe of snow that promised only death for those who dared challenge it. Inside, the darkness was louder than any blizzard, a symphony of creaks and groans played by the shrinking cabin logs. Cabin fever, the notorious psychological ailment of the isolated pioneer, had begun its slow, insidious work, turning friend against friend in the deepest recesses of the mind. Paranoia became the only reliable currency. A cough in the night wasn't just a sign of illness. It was a calculated threat, a signal that someone was failing faster, potentially consuming air or warmth that others needed and deserved more. Trust, once the bedrock of this little community, had evaporated like steam on ice. They started seeing things in the deep shadows of the corners, where the cold gathered thickest. The intricate grain patterns of the rough-hewn logs became distorted faces, whispering terrible accusations of gluttony and failure from the past. Sleep offered absolutely no escape. It was populated by horrifically vivid dreams of lavish feasts, roaring fireplaces, and tables piled high with steaming meat, only to wake up to the gnawing reality of empty bellies and frozen, stinging breath. The line between hallucination and reality was razor thin, constantly shifting with their plummeting blood sugar. But the final, unavoidable crisis was not physiological. It was practical. The woodpile, guarded fiercely like a king's ransom and measured down to the sliver, finally shrank past the point of feasibility. The very last dry knot of pine was placed on the meager coals, sputtering its final, despairing defiance against the unstoppable elemental cold. The air temperature plummeted instantly, and the remaining heat fled the room, sucked away by the mountain itself. This was the moment of truth, the absolute, non-negotiable end of the forced hibernation plan. Survival now depended not on conservation and stillness, but on a terrifying, desperate gamble against the forces of nature. They had to procure resources, but the world outside was a death trap. The snow was now estimated to be 30 feet deep, unforgiving, impossible to traverse without sinking into immediate, fatal hypothermia. Yet, the alternative was immediate, prolonged freezing. They drew lots, using slivers of broken crockery smoothed by nervous fingers, their hands trembling not just from cold, but from the immense, crushing gravity of the task ahead. The mission: find the buried cache of dried jerky and stiff hides they had strategically hidden 100 yards away during the relative warmth of early December. It was a suicide mission disguised as the last flicker of hope. The chosen man, a giant of a pioneer named Silas, who had been fading the fastest due to his massive caloric requirements, pulled the shortest straw. His eyes, sunken deep into his skull, held a mixture of absolute resignation and pure, primal terror. Preparing to leave the cabin was an agonizing, slow-motion ritual. Every layer of stiff, frozen clothing felt like lead weights added to a dying man's burden. The door, the last barrier between them and the crushing weight of the Rocky Mountain winter, was about to open. When Silas finally wrestled the frozen wooden bolt free, a blast of air hit the cabin, an Arctic punch that stole the breath right out of their lungs. It wasn't just cold. It was the sheer force of elemental warfare. He stepped out, sinking immediately up to his chest in powdery, unforgiving snow, a solitary, desperate figure dissolving instantly into the endless, blinding white landscape.
The other 3 remaining settlers watched the door slam shut, sealing them back into their frozen hell. They listened intently for the sounds of his struggle, the rasp of the shovel, the cries of failure.
But their attention was rapidly shifting. It was not focused solely on Silas's potential success or guaranteed failure. It was focused, with a chilling intensity, on the space he had left behind. Silas had been the biggest of them all. Silas had the most caloric reserve remaining, or at least he had until this moment. If he failed, if the mountain swallowed him whole, the 3 remaining had just gained a tiny, critical, temporary extension on their lease on life. And if he succeeded, he would bring back the hope of food, but he would also bring back the terrifying, undeniable obligation to share it. The mathematics of starvation are brutal, unforgiving, and always favor the absolute few. The line between pioneer and predator wasn't just obliterated, it had been drawn anew, etched in the frost of the window pane, waiting for the return, or the merciful absence, of Silas. The real terror wasn't the cold outside. It was the calculation being performed in the heart of the cabin, the monstrous reckoning of who gets to survive the next week, and the unspeakable price that must be paid to make it happen. This was not merely reducing rations. This was a deliberate, controlled descent into a biological abyss. A self-imposed coma designed not only to cheat the grave, but to become the grave for a few agonizing months. They called it the sleep, but it was a waking nightmare, a metabolic torture test where every second was measured in diminishing returns of glycogen. The first step was the slow cooling of the core temperature. Relying on the sheer inefficiency of the cabin's insulation and the biting, relentless cold seeping through the chinks in the logs, They allowed their bodies to drop 2 or 3 degrees below normal. This terrifying reduction in heat drastically slowed the heart rate and the frantic burning of precious fat reserves.
Every beat saved was a day earned, a cruel and mathematically elegant equation etched into the frost that rimmed their shallow breaths. Elias had read the desperate accounts of voyageurs and trappers who had attempted this impossible feat. But reading about starvation was an intellectual exercise. Living it was a spiritual vivisection that stripped away humanity layer by layer. The initial week was the worst, a period of unrelenting, agonizing hunger pains that felt like hot irons twisting in the gut, demanding fuel that simply did not exist within the walls of their wooden tomb. The children, already frail and possessing smaller thermal masses, adapted faster to the near catatonic state, slipping more easily into the low-energy void required for survival.
But the adults, burdened by memory, responsibility, and the crushing knowledge of their doomed decision, fought the approaching darkness. They had to remain partially conscious, maintaining a bare minimum of awareness solely to tend the fire, the only tether to reality, the single flickering point of defense against the absolute zero outside that waited to consume them. Even that necessary labor, the slow, agonizing repositioning of a log, became an act of agonizing metabolic expense, requiring minutes of recovery. Imagine the suffocating silence in that cabin. No stirring, no laughter, no activity, just the shallow, rattling breaths of 4 human beings and the relentless tick-tock dread emanating from the dwindling woodpile.
As the limited fat reserves vanished like smoke, the body, seeking survival at any cost, began its cannibalistic feast. The settlers plunged into severe nutritional ketosis, a physiological state where the brain, starved of its preferred fuel, glucose, started consuming ketones, a toxic byproduct of fat breakdown.
This transition brought a terrifying, almost manic clarity, mixed with debilitating confusion and profound disorientation. This wasn't just physical weakness. This was the brain hallucinating salvation, playing cruel, vivid tricks on their minds. They saw faces in the swirling shadows cast by the meager firelight, heard the phantom sound of a distant stream when only solid ice existed for miles, and worst of all, smelled the phantom scent of fresh-baked bread that was merely the chemical reaction of their dying bodies. They were ghosts living within their own rapidly decaying temples, their once strong muscles beginning to atrophy, turning their limbs into thin, useless sticks of skin and bone.
Elias watched his wife, Sarah, her eyes wide and unfocused, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, and he knew they were running out of time and substance. The internal battle against starvation was matched only by the absolute terror of the external world, which was pressing in on them with murderous intent.
The roof above them began to groan under the unimaginable, unrelenting weight of the incessant snowfall that had buried the cabin halfway up the chimney line. Each creak and snap of the overburdened timber sounded like a pistol shot in the deathly silence, reminding them that their protective shell was constantly threatening catastrophic collapse. If the roof gave way, the crushing cold would rush in, extinguishing life in a matter of minutes, rendering all their sacrifices pointless. And then there was the wildlife. Starvation was not just a human affliction on the mountain. It was a universal currency of death. The wolves, driven mad by the lack of prey, and sensing the profound weakness and stagnant heat signature radiating from the buried structure, circled the cabin nightly. Their deep, echoing howls were not just noise. They were a psychological countdown, a chilling promise of a breach that Elias knew they were too weak to repel. He meticulously maintained the survival journal, scrawling faint, desperate entries by the dim, flickering light of a tallow stub. The ink was freezing faster than he could write the damning statistics. He documented the dwindling rations, the plummeting temperatures, and the horrific weight loss that saw their bodies shedding pounds, not of fat, but of essential muscle and organ tissue. But the last column in the ledger, the one that truly mattered to Ozias's soul, was reserved for measuring spirit. And that column was hemorrhaging vitality at an unsustainable rate. They had entered the deep, lethal winter phase, the time when hope itself was metabolized faster than calories, turning optimism into a fatal energy expenditure. They were too weak to hunt, too completely buried to even attempt to flee, and too proud, or perhaps just too stubborn, to simply die easily. They were locked in a living grave of their own making, waiting for a spring that felt less like a seasonal certainty and more like a cruel myth whispered by the dying to justify the pain. The unspeakable price, the monstrous reckoning, was now being paid not in tangible goods, but in the slow, agonizing sacrifice of human vitality and the erosion of sanity. They were simply shells, waiting for the final, brutal wind to break them. The hibernation was a calculated lie. They called it rest, a metabolic slowdown designed to cheat the monstrous arithmetic of the winter. But every shallow, rattling breath drawn in that frozen earth was less a victory against extinction and more a surrender to agonizing delay. Their bodies, starved not just of calories, but of the basic restorative nature of true sleep, began to operate on pure, corrosive instinct, turning the silent cabin into a psychological torture chamber, where screaming was constant inside the skull, yet silence reigned outside. The sheer weight of the snowdrifts, now towering well above the window frames, was a palpable force pressing down on the crude timber roof, reinforcing the terrifying truth. They were not merely housed, they were entombed. The meticulous stacks of firewood, the supposed bulwark against this geological scale assault, had not just dwindled, they had evaporated, consumed by the relentless, ravenous appetite of the mountain's cold. Now the rationing was beyond brutal. A single meager log was stretched across an entire 24-hour cycle, transforming the cabin's interior from simply frigid to a space where the air itself felt like splintered, sharp ice shards entering the lungs with every inhale. Their extremities, fingers and toes perpetually numb, had begun the slow, insidious march toward necrosis, a silent, dark rot spreading beneath the skin that the settlers dared not look at too closely, knowing that acknowledgement meant amputation, and amputation meant certain death by shock and infection. The hunger, initially a sharp, aggressive pain that demanded action, had long since modulated into a dull, ever-present emptiness, a phantom limb of the stomach that constantly ached with phantom cravings. But the physical pain paled in comparison to the mental betrayal, the waking nightmares that seized them during their enforced torpor. The brain, desperate for caloric energy, began to fabricate feasts with a cruel, hyper-realistic precision that magnified the suffering exponentially. Eleanor swore she could smell the yeast and butter of the bread her mother used to bake. Young David would wake in shivering fits, convinced he'd just had a mouthful of crisp-cured bacon, only to find his tongue heavy and metallic with dehydration. This wasn't just starvation. It was the mind eating itself, consuming logic, hope, and sanity in exchange for fleeting, painful illusions that made the reality of the frozen gruel all the more intolerable. The forced proximity of the 6 remaining souls was now a crucible of suspicion, not comfort. The silence that filled the gaps between their labored breathing wasn't shared peace, it was mutual monitoring, a pressurized atmosphere of mistrust. Every blink, every shift in position, every quiet cough was interpreted through the dark, paranoid lens of immediate survival.
They had agreed to the hibernation pact, a desperate covenant of shared suffering and equal sacrifice, but the invisible cracks of self-interest were starting to show, specifically centered around the small iron lockbox containing the final, pulverized remnants of their dried rations. The doctors of the era had no terminology for what they were experiencing, but their bodies were engaged in a radical, involuntary biological defense mechanism akin to mammalian torpor, a state the human body is catastrophically unsuited for maintaining long-term. Their heart rates plummeted to alarming lows, sometimes barely registering 30 beats per minute on the wrist, mimicking the approach of death. But unlike true restorative hibernation, they were trapped in a perpetual state of half-wakefulness, a fragile, shallow sleep where the slightest noise, the settling of the house's stress fractures, the faint, distant howl of the wind would rip them violently back to conscious, shivering, gut-wrenching misery. The lack of sanitation, compounded by weeks of immobility and minimal water for washing, turned the cabin into a biological time bomb. Waste was managed minimally, frozen solid in corners or hastily dumped outside only during the briefest, most dangerous lulls in the continuous blizzard. Scurvy, the ancient killer of sea voyages and static isolation, began its gruesome, methodical work. It signaled its arrival with gums that bled at the slightest touch, vast blackening bruises appearing spontaneously across the skin without cause, and a profound, bone-deep fatigue that no amount of rest could cure. Their immune systems, decimated by months of caloric deficit and vitamin depletion, offered no resistance to the spreading pestilence, turning minor scratches into festering, life-threatening wounds. To combat the terrifying descent into total fatalism and prevent anyone from intentionally slipping into the warm, enticing comfort of terminal hypothermia, a dreadful ritual had emerged, the Watcher's Hour. For 60 minutes each day,
one person was designated to remain fully awake, their consciousness sharpened by the smallest, most bitter fraction of the day's water ration, tasked solely with observing the others. Their grim job was to ensure that no one succumbed to the siren call of death, or worse, made a sudden, desperate move for the hidden lockbox. The watcher was the thin, frayed, barely visible thread of humanity, preventing outright murder and self-destruction in the suffocating dark. The silence, heavy and complete, became their executioner. It was a pressure cooker of unexpressed fear, gnawing guilt, and unspoken accusation, a testament to how utterly their shared ambition had failed them. They were no longer actively surviving the winter. The winter was passively processing them, grinding down their physical resistance, their emotional boundaries, and their very identities into the fine, powdery dust of the high-altitude snow. The drifts outside had not only climbed past the roofline, but had begun to freeze solid around the foundations, trapping the last vestiges of heat and fresh air in a terrifying vacuum. They had tried to conquer the mountain by slowing down, by minimizing their presence, but the mountain, in its infinite, icy patience, required only one thing: for them to stop breathing altogether. They were simply shells now, hollowed out by cold and starvation, waiting not for the spring thaw, but for the final internal break, where the mind finally gives up the fight and invites the darkness in.
They had survived the initial shock of the White Terror, the long, grinding approach of November and December that stole their strength piece by agonizing piece. But the true monster of the Rockies, the heart of the killing season, always arrived when the calendar turned, bringing with it the month of iron. This was the time when the temperature didn't just drop, it collapsed, driving the mercury down until the very air felt like shattered glass, slicing into the lungs with every desperate breath. The remaining logs, saved for this critical juncture, burned with a furious, futile energy, fighting a battle they could never win against the vast, crushing indifference of the atmosphere. Inside the cabin, the moisture from their breath froze instantly upon the walls, creating a shimmering, deadly crust of rime that seemed to mock their pathetic attempts at warmth.
Their state of forced torpor, that delicate balance between life and death, sustained by sheer willpower and meager rations, was now starting to unravel. The body, pushed past the point of endurance, began to betray the mind. It started with the silence, a silence so profound it was no longer peaceful, but threatening, filling their ears with the phantom shrieks of wind that wasn't there.
Then came the tremor, a deep, unsettling vibration, not from the earth, but from the relentless internal shivering that defied the layers of blankets and furs they huddled beneath. This wasn't just cold. This was the foundational structure of the human mechanism beginning to fail, the last stores of fat and muscle being cannibalized by a desperate engine. They called it the hunger dream, a waking nightmare where the scent of non-existent cooked meat was so vivid, so overpowering, that men would chew on their own leather gloves just to feel something substantial
against their teeth. The true terror was the realization of how few calories they had left to burn through the next 6 weeks. The time when, historically, the snowpack was at its deepest, and escape was literally impossible.
The ledger, kept meticulously by old man Kincaid, was a death sentence written in fading ink. 4 pounds of salted pork remaining. Enough for perhaps 3 more days if they ate nothing else, or stretched across 2 weeks if they continued their regimen of near starvation. The math was simple, brutal, and inescapable. Something had to give.
And that something arrived not in the gentle promise of a false thaw, but in a sudden, sickening sound that ripped through the cabin's fragile calm like a gunshot. It was a guttural, wet tearing, followed by a sound that every settler knew instantly, the desperate, panicked snort of livestock under attack. The meager, emaciated oxen, which they had hoped might survive long enough to pull the plow in the spring, were now screaming their final, terrified goodbyes. The air instantly filled with the metallic tang of fresh blood, a scent so intoxicatingly rich after weeks of deprivation that it acted like a powerful, deadly drug. It woke the sleeping hunger in the cabin's inhabitants, turning their pale, sunken eyes into pinpricks of frantic, animalistic desire. They weren't just fighting the wolves for survival. They were fighting them for the right to consume the remains of their own future.
Through the narrow, ice-rimmed window slit, young Thomas saw the shape, not a lone wolf, but a pack. Massive timber giants driven mad by the deep winter, their coats thick and matted with snow, their eyes burning with a prehistoric, merciless intent. And leading them, the alpha, a beast the size of a small pony, its jaws locked onto the ox's throat, shaking it with casual, devastating power.
Man Kincaid, the elder, grabbed the only remaining rifle, its mechanism stiff and sluggish with the cold, his hands shaking violently, not from fear, but from the sheer absence of strength. He knew the rifle held only 3 rounds. 3 rounds to secure a carcass worth a month of life. The odds were laughable, but they were the only currency left in this frozen hell.
He barked an order, his voice a dry, rasping whisper that somehow carried the weight of command. We move now, before they drag the best cuts away. If you stop to think, you're dead. Move. The instant they threw open the heavy plank door, the cold hit them not like a blanket, but like a physical blow, slamming the air from their lungs and freezing the tears in their eyes before they could even fall. It was -30 degrees, a temperature that turned flesh brittle and made steel lethally cold to the touch. Their bodies, accustomed to the stagnant air of the cabin, protested the shock with violent spasms and involuntary vomiting.
They stumbled into the snowdrifts, sinking chest deep immediately, their movement agonizingly slow, like wading through thick, frozen molasses. The snow crunched beneath their threadbare boots, a dreadful symphony played for the circling predators, who watched their pathetic approach with cold, calculating patience. The wolves understood this transaction perfectly. The settlers were offering their own weakened bodies as collateral for the meat they craved. This wasn't a fight for defense. This was a savage, sub-zero bidding war with death, where the price of a single pound of meat might be the loss of a finger, a limb, or the whole damned soul. Kincaid raised the rifle, the heavy metal biting into his cheek. Aiming was impossible. The target was a chaotic mass of fur, muscle, and fresh slaughter. He fired the first round not at the alpha, but into the ground near the largest wolf, hoping the thunderous echo would buy them a second of advantage. The sound, magnified tenfold by the crystalline mountain air, was deafening, momentarily scattering the pack. 2 wolves peeled away instantly, but the alpha remained, its head snapping up, dripping blood, its gaze fixing on Kincaid with an intelligence that was far more frightening than mere animal instinct. It saw the weakness, the desperation, the fragile humanity standing against the elemental power of the wild. Their hands, clumsy and numb, had made contact with the bitter cold of the iron axe handles and the frozen meat, fusing the nerves to the metal. They were bleeding profusely from tiny fissures in their skin, caused by the extreme contraction of their tissues. But they had meat. They had survived the immediate confrontation. They slammed the door shut, locking themselves back into the dark confines, now facing a new horror, the feverish sickness that would accompany the sudden ingestion of rich, raw meat after months of famine, and the inevitable infection creeping into their wounded, frozen extremities. The crucible had just begun to heat up. The meat, that sacred, raw offering from the late-season kill, a burst of iron and fat that promised strength, but it behaved like absolute poison inside their compromised digestive tracts. Their systems, optimized for months of near-zero caloric input, suddenly faced the violent influx of complex proteins, fats, and minerals, triggering internal chaos known to doctors centuries later as refeeding syndrome, a deadly, silent dance of electrolyte imbalance that stole the very energy needed for recovery, threatening to stop the heart that had just begun beating normally again. Cramping was relentless, a deep, twisting agony in the gut that made the months of starvation pangs seem like a distant, polite complaint. It was the body violently rejecting the very thing it desperately needed to survive, flushing vital nutrients into the icy abyss. Cabin fever, magnified by malnutrition, the stench of decay, and the constant specter of death, began to manifest in terrifying new ways, twisting trusted faces into menacing masks in the dim, oily light cast by the meager tallow lamp, which they dared only burn for 2 hours a night to conserve the precious, rancid fat. Small slights became capital offenses. A misplaced spoon could trigger a half-hour-long, screaming, hysterical argument that echoed unnervingly off the packed snow surrounding the tiny structure, revealing a raw, terrifying edge of madness in every surviving soul, a madness that threatened to turn them against each other after surviving the mountain's worst. They started hiding things: the last piece of jerky, a sharpened stick, a tin cup. driven by the primal animal instinct that the closest threat was now the man sleeping 3 feet away, not the cold outside. Realizing that community was dissolving into pure competitive self-preservation. And yet, the true crushing horror, the realization that eclipsed their internal misery, was the discovery that their efforts to survive inside had inadvertently created a new, lethal threat outside. The relentless, howling drifts had packed against the cabin walls, not just insulating them, but creating an almost impenetrable fortress of ice and compacted snow, towering 12 feet high in some places, compressing the timber under monumental geological force.
They were not merely snowed in. They were now definitively entombed, sealed off from the potential spring sun, trapped in a colossal, frozen grave of their own making. The air within becoming stale, thick and heavy, laced with the metallic tang of sickness and the pervasive smell of unwashed bodies and dying tissue. The thin trickle of air allowed by the single small chimney vent was utterly insufficient for 4 breathing, recovering bodies whose metabolism was suddenly demanding massive quantities of oxygen to repair the damage of starvation, driving them into a state of low-grade hypoxia that fueled paranoia and hallucinations.
Driven by suffocating panic, they took desperate turns, using the only tool they dared risk, a broken shovel handle sharpened to a rough point, to punch tiny exploratory tunnels through the dense, packed snow near the roofline, hoping to breach the crust. Each punch was a monumental struggle against the crushing weight of the Rockies themselves, magnified by their weakness. Knowing that even a slight structural collapse meant instant, smothering burial, a faster death than starvation, but no less terrifying. The pressure on the log walls was visibly bowing the timber, creating ominous creaking sounds that spoke of imminent failure, forcing them to shore up the interior with the remaining pieces of their meager furniture. The silence of the mountain was now deceptive, a pressure cooker of auditory expectation. Days bled into weeks, characterized only by the muted, distant thud of massive snowslides moving on higher peaks, sounds they couldn't see, which only enhanced the feeling of cosmic insignificance and total isolation. Then came the sound that froze their blood, a scratching, subtle at first, dismissed as mice or shifting timber, but growing steadily more deliberate, more rhythmic, sending icy, immediate dread straight to the center of their chests, originating somewhere near the foundation, just beyond the thin log wall, a sound that spoke not of desperation, but of calculated patience. They knew, logically, that the deepest part of the winter had driven every large, hungry creature to the lowest possible elevations, desperate for any lingering warmth or scent of life, seeking the anomaly of a semi-heated space. They dared not speak the name of the great, shaggy beast that might be investigating the anomaly of the warm, smoky timber structure, but the scratching continued, circling the perimeter like a grim sentinel, probing the weakest points of their self-made prison, a methodical, terrifying investigation. It was a predator, sensing the return of fragile life, calculating the precise risk-reward ratio of breaking through the snow crust and the thin log wall to reach the rich human sustenance within. The same meager cache of dried powder they had used for their last meals during the famine was now being mixed with their precious, dwindling gunpowder, creating crude, explosive charges wrapped in oilcloth, prepared to be detonated should the beast breach the wall. The ultimate irony of their horrific journey, they had survived the psychological and physical crucible of forced hibernation, only to be stalked by a massive, hungry sentinel waiting for the spring thaw to deliver its meal. The isolation was over, replaced by immediate, terrifying engagement. The actual fight for life, the bloody, screaming conflict, was just about to erupt in the dark, suffocating confines of their frozen tomb, a final, violent test against the mountain's enduring, brutal patience. The conflict didn't need a signal. It just arrived, silent and chilling. It wasn't the roar of a starving bear. It was the whisper of suspicion, a poison that seeped into the very foundation of their survival pact. They had trusted each other with their lives, yet here, in the eternal midnight of the den, trust was the first casualty.
Jedediah, the patriarch, woke not to cold, but to an unnatural quiet. The oil lamp, usually tended religiously by his wife Ilara, was sputtering, dying, not from lack of wick, but from lack of fuel. The precious, rancid bear grease, painstakingly rendered and rationed for the next 2 weeks, was gone.
It hadn't been spilled. The small ceramic crock was unnervingly clean, scraped down to the clay. A thief among the frozen saints. A predator wearing the face of kin, lurking within the shadows of their collective tomb. Starvation does not just weaken the body, it sharpens the mind into a terrifying weapon, turning every shadow into a conspirator and every breath into an accusation. The settlers, already existing on the brittle edge of lucidity, felt the structure of their shared reality crumble, falling away into the abyss of madness. Who would steal the light? Who would dare risk the collective death for a few extra moments of fleeting, greasy warmth? The silence in the cabin became a living, screaming entity, demanding an answer that no one wanted to give, demanding a sacrifice for the greater good.
Jedediah's eyes, sunken and ringed with purple, scanned the huddled figures, assessing the weakness, measuring the desperation. His voice, a dry, cracking sound from disuse, cut through the deep cold like a rusty saw blade, carrying the weight of ultimate authority and fear. "The oil," he rasped, the word tasting of metal and betrayal. "It is gone." All eyes swung instinctively to Silas, the youngest adult, who had been shivering uncontrollably for days, his fever spiking and dipping like a broken barometer, radiating illness and fear. He was the weak link, the logical sacrifice, the one most likely to panic and consume the forbidden stores in a fit of calorie-crazed delirium. The true resource they fought over wasn't the grease or the heat, it was the pistol.
a single-shot muzzleloader held loosely beneath Elara's shawl, meant for the final, merciful duty if the winter proved too long. The ultimate power. Now it represented the authority to decide who lived and who starved first. The right to mete out justice. Jedediah lunged, his movements shockingly fast, fueled by the terrifying adrenaline of betrayal and hunger, his hands reaching for the cold, unforgiving steel. Elara, his wife of 20 years, the woman who had birthed his children in this God-forsaken wilderness, met his desperation with a savage, animalistic snarl, guarding the relic of power like a starving she-wolf. The world dissolved into a flurry of ragged wool and skeletal limbs. A silent, sickening wrestling match played out in the absolute darkness, illuminated only by the frantic, dying flicker of the abused, almost empty lamp. They were reduced to primal instinct, fighting over the right to kill or be killed in the subterranean hell. But as the family tore itself apart, focused entirely on the internal threat of treachery and madness, the mountain decided to intervene, offering a brutal external counterpoint to their petty squabbles. The roof groaned. Not the gentle, settling groan they had grown accustomed to, the sound of logs shifting under the persistent, heavy siege of the cold. This was a deep, structural shriek, like the spine of a massive beast snapping under impossible pressure. A sound that promised immediate, catastrophic failure. The relentless, crushing weight of the accumulated snowpack, perhaps 50 feet thick above their heads, had finally found the weak spot in the poorly supported timber frame. The very air in the chamber shifted, thick and heavy, carrying the stench of frozen earth and pine rot, foretelling a disaster of biblical proportions. A sudden, violent cascade of icy debris erupted through the makeshift ceiling above the sleeping loft, blinding and deafening in its fury. Dust and freezing powder filled the air instantly, choking them, blinding them, turning their haven into a blizzard. The tomb was opening, but only to let the cold fury of the Rockies pour in, accelerating their demise from slow starvation to rapid, agonizing freezing. They had ripped a hole in their own defense, and the mountain was eager to exploit the vulnerability with immediate, crushing force. As the cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and decay, something else was exposed by the falling ceiling debris, a twist of fate only the devil could conjure. Wedged tightly into the rotting log rafters, hidden from the light, was a small, crudely wrapped bundle. It was not Silas who had stolen the sustenance. It was the remaining portion of the stolen bear grease, wrapped meticulously in treated hide, placed there months ago by Elara herself, not to consume, but to hide the last reserves from the inevitable descent into collective madness. She hadn't stolen it. She had protected it. A desperate gamble, knowing that the moment of lucidity would fail them all, and that the only true enemy was the hunger itself. But now, in the chaos of the structural failure, her desperate secret defense was ruined. exposed to the deadly elements. The structural integrity of the entire den was now fundamentally questionable. The cold was a physical presence, a monstrous, paralyzing entity settling into their lungs and chilling their marrow to freezing point, beyond salvation. The bloody internal conflict had achieved what the mountain could not. It had broken the sanctuary. The temperature inside the lair plummeted instantly, dropping 10 degrees in as many seconds, making every breath a burning agony. The fragile balance of their forced hibernation was shattered. They had woken up, not to salvation or spring, but to the certainty that they must now fight the very air they breathed, in a freezing chamber that was rapidly becoming their coffin, buried alive. The long sleep was violently over, and the screaming, freezing vigil of the final weeks had begun. They were exposed, betrayed by their own survival instincts, and freezing, staring directly into the face of a winter that was finally ready to claim its due, down to the last shuddering breath.